Okay, I say let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to the Oregon Outdoor School Instructional Resource Self-Evaluation Tool Introduction to version 3.0. Here's a super quick Zoom tutorial, which I'm certain that none of you need, so it'll be very quick. Mute and unmute, as I said. Stay on mute if you don't want to appear in the recording, and then feel free to use the chat, or if you're comfortable appearing on the recording, since we have such a small group, you're welcome to simply unmute yourself and ask questions or provide comments as you would like. Steve, do you have something to add? No, okay. Thought I saw you go off mute. All right, so I'm Christy Bakke. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the OSU Extension Service Outdoor School Programs Curriculum and Professional Development Coordinator. And I'm going to be one of the facilitators today. As the Professional Development Coordinator, I tend to think about a lot of these things as what can we learn from you about PD support that we can provide. And so I focus a lot of my attention on that. And the document that we're going to talk about today, which we often call the IRSET, the Instructional Resource Self-Evaluation Tool, is a great example of the sort of curriculum work that I do. And so recognizing the sort of diversity across many facets of outdoor school in Oregon, we don't provide a standardized curriculum, and we don't plan to provide a standardized curriculum. And so our focus in curriculum support is on providing tools that outdoor school providers and schools can use to improve their curriculum on their own with our support. And so I sort of come at this with that lens. And I will pass it off to Steve to introduce himself.
Thanks, Christy. So Stephen Braun, cisgendered, white, able-bodied male. I'm a single parent, certified special education teacher, scientist, and evaluator. And I'm on the traditional homeland of the Kalapuya. And I'm going to be approaching this work, this presentation from an evaluative perspective, and just kind of providing some background in evaluative thinking and how we can use evaluation as a tool for change within our programs. And then do me just announce Renee before I pass it back to you? Sure. So Renee O'Neill, the former curriculum and PD coordinator who preceded Christy Bakke, helped with version 2 of this, and also helped with some of the final review for this version 3. And so we just want to acknowledge her pivotal work and getting us here today. With that, I'll pass it back.
Thanks, Steve. All right, so we would like to frame today with a land acknowledgement. So as we often say, all outdoor education takes place on Indigenous homelands. I, like Steve, am on the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya here in Corvallis. And we like to start by sort of recognizing both the historical and current relationships that Indigenous peoples have with the land. So Indigenous peoples have been living on this place we now call Oregon since time immemorial, and we want to honor this continuous relationship with the land that continues into the present day. And it's one thing to acknowledge this, so to do a land acknowledgement, but the land acknowledgement doesn't erase a history of genocide and colonialism. And so the land acknowledgement itself is not the work, right? We have to do something more. And so this idea is related sort of to what we're going to be talking about today, that we can't, for example, well, you could, but we wouldn't recommend doing a land acknowledgement and then implementing a curriculum that erases Indigenous peoples, relegates them to the past, things like that. And so this idea of acknowledging and respecting and honoring Indigenous peoples and their relationships with the land is very closely tied to the idea of the curriculum that we use at outdoor school. And so as we will talk about a little bit later, when we go through some of the changes in this version. We want to think about how we can honor and recognize these relationships within all the work that we do at Outdoor School. And part of the reason this is so important is because settler colonialism is often thought of as something that happened in the past, that this land was taken or invaded or settled, and that happened 200, 300 years ago. But actually, it's an ongoing process. This idea of continuing to take over lands, to run pipelines through sacred lands, to erase people from the narrative is an ongoing process. And so we hope that the ERSET can be one tool that in a small way, people can use to sort of help push back on that narrative. And so thank you for the work that you do in that regard. All right, so we are here today to talk about the instructional resource self-evaluation tool, the third version. So the purpose of this tool is to support outdoor school programs in developing or improving their instructional resources and curriculum. So this is, if you're familiar with version 2.0, this is a very similar purpose. The basic sort of idea and structure of the document has not changed, but we have made quite a few changes sort of within the specifics of the document. So this focuses on instructional resources and curriculum. So what are those two things? This is sort of central to the way that the tool is organized. So instructional resources are the individual components that sort of describe what you're engaging students in doing and how you're engaging them in doing that. So this would be things like lesson plans or activities that you have written out, field studies, but it also includes things like the lyrics to the songs that you sing around the campfire. So there's this whole range of resources, whole range of experiences that students have at Outdoor School. And it's our hope that this tool can support you in reflecting on all of those activities that students engage in, not just those ones that have specific learning objectives. And so then you take all of these resources and sort of put them together, and they make the curriculum, right? So Outdoor School is more than just like a collection of random instructional resources. So you have probably in your program sort of arranged them in a way that you think is cohesive, where things build on each other. So for example, you might recognize that you have this gap in your curriculum and choose an instructional resource that will fill that gap, because you're sort of looking holistically at the whole Outdoor School experience. And so the ERSET is designed to sort of help at both of these levels, both in supporting you in reviewing those individual components, like the lyrics of a song or a particular field study, but then also sort of thinking at this bigger picture level about your curriculum as a whole. And so now Steve's going to sort of take you through just a really big picture overview of the history of the document and sort of the reason why we made some of the changes that we did.
You can go to the next slide, Christy. Thanks. So yeah, we are updating the ERSET. So first, a little just very brief historical overview. This is the third iteration of some sort of evaluative tool for looking at curriculum and instructional resources. The first, which we'll call version 1, was just titled the rubric. And I'm pretty sure it came out in 2017, soon thereafter statewide funding. And it looked very different from our current suite of self-eval tools. Version 2, which we released during the 2020 Provider and Facilities Gathering at Camp Tadmore, established the current structure for both the
Uh-oh. Am I lost or is Steve lost?
Steve is lost.
All right.
Making a point.
and the cultural responsiveness.
You were lost, Steve. I think
My
you're
bad.
back.
Okay, good.
You
I'll
started
put the
talking
slide
about the
over.
provider gathering and then
Oh, good.
you went
Okay.
dark.
So, yeah, the ERSET version 2 established the structure, and really how we apply all of the self-eval tools in our programs are kind of broadly. And it's the same structure used in the special education and accessibility self-eval tool and the cultural responsiveness self-eval tool, the CSET and the CURSET respectively. And then now version 3, which follows a very similar structure, but is updated based on a lot of different places of input. And we'll talk about those with some specifics, but that is everything from casual feedback to we implemented our program and we took notes on it, to a series of pilots that we ran based on the other self-eval tools in this suite. Now, all of this, I just want to point to, relates to this idea of design-based evaluation, where we craft an evaluation, we implement an evaluation, we look at what we learned from that, we then implement this in our programs, and then we go back to the drawing board and update the eval. And that continues. It's kind of like adaptive management. And that's something that we are doing across the board in our evaluations, in professional development, in our programming. And so with that, we really want to invite participation at every stage of the game. We invite you to give us feedback, to step into leadership roles, to invite people to the table who aren't traditionally at the table, and empower them, so we can all make the work we do better for the students at Oregon. Okay, so with that, Christy, do you want to share a story around feedback that we've got that we tried to incorporate in this new version?
Sure. Yeah, I can share just sort of a couple little anecdotes of the sort of feedback we received. So one sort of story that we heard was that a group tried to use it and basically kept getting stuck on not being able to reach consensus on exactly how an instructional resource should be qualified. So is this particular characteristic highly effective, or is it just emerging? And that this focus on consensus sort of derailed the progress in a lot of the conversations. And so something that we've done in the new version is add a tip section that tries to sort of address some of these things that we kept hearing about, sort of the roadblocks that folks were hitting when they went to use the tool, so that people have some guidance on, the goal is not actually to reach consensus. The goal is to have deep conversations about our lessons, our instructional resources, and how we can improve them. And also we receive feedback sort of on little specific things of like, this part is confusing, or if you mean this, you should just come out and say that. And so I'll talk a little bit more about those towards the end of the specifics of those. Thanks, Steve.
Sure. Yeah, and just to that point about talking about the specific changes, that for those folks who are going to be watching this at home, are slides 24 through 27. I don't know what the timing is in that, but you can skip ahead if that's all you need. Go to the next one, please, Christy. Okay, so just a little bit more framing before we jump into this. I want to start with just a reminder of evaluative thinking and break down this simplified evaluation cycle with some examples specific to Oregon outdoor schools. So many of us might think about evaluation kind of narrowly, and only really consider the first number here in evaluation. So I'm going to begin with that in this cycle and explaining that, but I really want to assert that evaluation is much, much broader than just this first bullet of evaluating. Okay, so let me break this down. The first bullet, this is where we consider, monitor, and evaluate. And so in Oregon outdoor schools, with the ERSET, that's the first half of these pages, this rubric where we look at the things that we're doing. But it's also the outcome-based surveys that are administered at the end of the program. So next, Then we move to the second bullet in the evaluation cycle, where we look at reflection and planning. We learn and we want to make connections. And this looks like professional development or action planning. And so this is the final pages of the ERSET, or targeted professional development, which is informed by our evaluation. And then finally, we move on to implementation and programming. This is all the awesome work that you do in your communities and in your outdoor schools. This looks like community engagement and culturally responsive programming. And then we repeat this cycle, and we're just going to continue at this. There's this idea that we're always reflecting and we're always iterating what we're doing. We're always changing in response to our students and in our communities. A couple other things I want to stress when we think about just evaluation broadly. All stages here are driven by the core value of equity. So that looks like the questions we ask, the professional development that we do, and the programming we implement. A couple other things, I'm going to kind of re-say what I said, but I just want to stress some points. So this is about evaluation to learning and then to practice. This is not about evaluation for reporting or performance. The point being that when we implement an evaluation, it's not to say, here, look what I did. It's to say, let me look at what I did and how do I improve based on the information I have. So therefore, when we think about the statewide program, professional development and evaluation are hand in hand and they walk in lockstep. I want to encourage folks to approach this work with humbleness and a growth mindset. People in programs might come to this with a ton of experience and have been writing curriculum for years, or they might just be getting started. And regardless, we all have a lot of work to do. Our students and our community's needs are constantly changing. And so the way we've designed these evaluation tools is they can be used for anyone in this, call it, schema of a lot of experience to just getting started. And then finally, something I say in every one of my presentations, evaluation is not a dirty word. Some folks might have these thoughts about middle school grades. Oh no, I got a C or a D and I got to bring it home. You're nervous. I know that happened for me a lot. Again, this isn't about grades. This is about growth. And so for those of you who decide to share your results in whatever venue, whether it be professional development or, hey, let's have some sort of way to just kind of keep this somewhere, these results will never be used in a punitive manner to the funding. Rather, it's to support you and your programs, to support our students. Okay, Chrissy, you can go to the next slide. One more just kind of evaluative context thing is this idea of inputs versus outcomes. So in Oregon Outdoor Schools, one way we evaluate outcomes, and I'm going to start here on the right side of the slide, is via surveys. These end of the survey, or end of the program outcome-based surveys. Essentially, this is the effect of our program, how our programming affects students. It's not the only way, but it's a slice at that. People often think about evaluation at this point. Now, this tool and the rest of the self-eval tools evaluates inputs, the things that we do, the programming, aka the cause. So input level versus outcome level. All of the self-eval tools really only focus on inputs. I do want to stress that this input and outcomes are very much aligned. And so, yeah. And then the other thing I just want to say is a metaphor for thinking about the differences between inputs and outcomes. So outcome evaluation considers the signal, right? The cell phone tower signal that's up in the air. Input level evaluation consider whatever puts it up. It actually looks at the cell phone tower. Anyways, maybe that helps. You can go to the next one, Christy. Okay, so we're going to begin, as I describe the structure of the ERSET, we're going to begin here with this first part of the evaluation cycle. This is the first half of the document. And Christy, I'm sorry, are we gonna, you just posted it, thank you.
Just pasted it. Yep.
Yeah, this is the first half of the document. I think it's maybe page 4 or 5 is where the rubric part starts. But again, when evaluating the inputs of curriculum and instructional resources, we start here. Yeah, you can go to the next. Okay, so I want to just break down the structure of this. And everyone who's on this call is familiar with this structure, but for the folks at home, if you're not, I invite you to really pay attention to the vocabulary here, because it really does set up how the document is structured so that then we can implement it in our programs. So first, when evaluating instructional resources and curriculum, we have 3 big themes. And these themes are context and setting for learning, content and integration, and instruction and pedagogy. Go to the next. Each of these 3 themes is comprised of characteristics. In the case of context and setting for learning, there are 5 distinct characteristics. So themes are broken into characteristics, and for each characteristic, you can go to the next. There's a row, if you will, that looks like this. And so first, on the leftmost column, the characteristic is defined. Next, for that characteristic, we qualify the characteristic in terms of absent, emerging, or highly effective. And there's information and examples in here that help a program understand how, for this characteristic, respectfully includes Indigenous experiences in relationship to the land, might look as an absent characteristic, an emergent characteristic, or a highly effective characteristic. And then in the far side, the rightmost part of the row is an empty cell for evidence. And so here is where, well, we'll get into that in a second. So this is how the rubric is structured. And one point I want to make here, for those of you who are familiar with rubrics, is that we intentionally chose not to use numbers. And I know that these are kind of common for rubric style input level evaluation. Let me tell you why. So first, the goal is not to score a program, curriculum, or instructional resource. And number values suggest this. This is that grades idea. The goal, as Dr. Bakke said at the beginning, is to promote critical reflection and learning, which subsequently leads to growth in our programming, in our practices. Second, the use of numbers would essentially weight each characteristic the same. This is an instrumentation issue. And so we recognize that some characteristics might be more or less important to your outdoor school and students. And so we don't want things to just be weighted evenly. And we want to empower programs to make those decisions about what is more or less important to their communities. You can go to the next, Christy. So I'm going to pause there. Folks have the ERSET. We just talked about a little bit of the structure, but not necessarily the content. And I want to just give folks a couple minutes to think about any questions they have about the structure of the ERSET. And we can talk about content later. Should we take 2-3 minutes? I mean, the folks that are on the call, I'm pretty sure everyone here's spent some time with this thus far. So.
Was there intention behind the order of the sort of major categories in the document? Context and setting, content integration and instruction and pedagogy? Like, was that ordered in a particular way? And if so, can you uncover that for me?
Yeah, there was intentionality with the order of the themes and the characteristics within them. Let me do my best to unpack that and say that in some cases, it was pretty clear. We felt like context and setting precedes the lesson. Content, right? That's what's in it. And then instruction and pedagogy is how it's distributed. So that seemed to flow for us pretty logically. The characteristics within them, yes. And sometimes it may not have been as rule, kind of positivist as possible. Some of those might have been like, this seems most important. I think we began with instruction and pedagogy. We felt like sound instructional design preceded, multimodal or these other pieces, which seem more about not stylistically, but how the instruction looked. And we felt like learner-centered, centering the students felt like having that occur before, let's say, if it's inquiry or something. So there was a fair amount of thought and intentionality in ordering the characteristics as well.
And Dan, if you have thoughts on other ways to organize them, or sort of what made you wonder that sure, we're putting out a new version today, but this is totally a living document. And so any feedback like that, we would love to have either in this forum or outside of it.
Yeah, thanks. No, it didn't strike me as like, why would you do it that way? It was more like I hadn't thought of that before. And I thought, well, I know that when we're sharing information, like where it comes in something provides an emphasis. And I was just curious if you had thought about that and if that was within here. So thanks. It helps me understand it a little bit better too, but I don't have any feedback on it. But I can look at it and, think about it.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
I'll also just extend that living document piece to the other self-eval tools. Maybe it's just like a teaching moment here I'm trying to step on that. Feedback in any and all of the evaluative tools would be helpful. So.
All right, Steve, do you want to take us on to the next one?
Yeah. Okay, so when talking about the qualifiers, I intentionally did not say how we go about qualifying a resource, because that's what this slide is about. So on page 3 of the ERSET, there is this step-by-step of how to use the tool. And I'm going to talk us through it. First, when looking at the conceptual model on the right, we begin again considering, monitoring, evaluating. So that's number 1 in the eval model, which is number 1, 2, and 3 here in the how to use this tool. So when considering and monitoring and evaluating, first, you're going to select your eval team. It's really important to seek diversity on this team, and that spans race, gender, roles, and many other. And when doing that, I would encourage those of you that are really selecting this team to really attend to issues of power and consider what it might be like if you're on a team and let's say some of the resources that you're evaluating are resources you've created and you have position of power with a colleague or with a community member, and how those power imbalances, issues could come to be, and seek to mediate them and make it so it's safe for folks to evaluate resources. Next, this is number 2, not in the eval model, but on the list on the left. Decide on the scope and structure of your evaluation. Consider how many people might evaluate an instructional resource. Consider if you're going to evaluate a subset of your curriculum or all of it. Again, this is really important to really just make sure that you set that. And we encourage folks to make sure that no one is evaluating a resource in isolation. And so that there's, power in that, just opportunity to discuss and work through and collaborate. Next, the third is to read and discuss each characteristic and really understand them. And then to qualify the resource and justify its qualification. So this is taking notes in the evidence column. And a piece that I didn't talk about was at the end of each theme, there's this kind of Uber evaluation or Uber reflection. And so we can reflect on all of it. And so it's really important to make sure you also put notes there. And the outcome of this discussion and qualification, again, is not about consensus or precise qualification. It's about reflection, discussion, and consideration. And so, like Christy said, folks could get hung up on finding consensus, and we really want folks not to. The process is more important than they landed here. You can go to the next slide. So now we move on to this other part of the evaluation cycle. So I'm looking at the rightmost conceptual model where it says reflect, connect, learn, and plan. And so in the how to use this tool on the left side, this looks like team discussion where everyone comes back and discusses how either the subset of the curriculum or the instructional resources were qualified and what things came up, what questions are still hanging, and you share that out. And everyone talks about that and has some time with that. Then, and this is something that Christy's going to take over, but you would use the curriculum report and improvement plan. And this is a new part. Well, it looks a lot different in this version of the ERSET. And so this is on page 19, where the team comes together and evaluates and reflects on all of the instructional resources which were evaluated. In other words, your curriculum, where it all comes together. This is an opportunity to do that. And so I'm going to pass it over to Christy here, and she's going to cruise from here on out. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the curriculum report and improvement plan. As Steve mentioned, this is about taking a broad view of all of your curriculum. So the tables that came before this are for looking at individual instructional resources. But then here's the point where we take, let's say you looked at 10 instructional resources, you take all 10 of those and look sort of comprehensively at what's the story we can take from looking at all 10 of these evaluations together. And so I'm going to just read quickly through these suggested directions and then sort of talk through them in a little bit more detail as I show the actual page and what it looks like. So the first thing is just a simple tally of sort of how did we qualify each instructional resource that we reviewed. Then this is really like a huge part of this whole process is the discussion that you're going to have with your team about how you've qualified the resource and sort of the evidence that you see in the resource that sort of led you to qualify it in that way. Then targeting one or more characteristics to sort of focus on for improvement, reflect on sort of what you found, and then translate that into action. So there's a curriculum improvement plan included in here as well. So let's go ahead and take a look at the tally sheet. And you can see the page numbers on the top right. So if you're following along on the actual document, this is on page 20. So this is simply a tally sheet with all of the characteristics listed, where you can use check marks or numbers or some sort of code, however you want to do it, to get a big picture look at all of the resources that you evaluated. And one of the tips that we added to this document is that there might be many opportunities or situations where when you're evaluating a resource, you're kind of like, well, for this characteristic, it has some aspects of emerging and some aspects of highly effective. it's totally okay to mark things in multiple places on here. Sometimes folks, and I'm a person who gets hung up on this sort of thing often too, like I like things to fit neatly in the box. And that's just not quite the type of work that we're doing here. And so I would encourage you to not be too frightened by that idea of having to mark one resource in 2 boxes. It's totally okay. And then there's a checklist at the end, which ones you target for improvement. And on the next page, there are some reflection questions. And in case you're following along just on the slides and don't have the document open, the orange text here is just the same text as appears on the page, but a little bit bigger so that hopefully you're able to read it. And so we expanded the reflection from version 2.0, which focused a lot on the challenges, but we really want to sort of push emphasis onto the assets, all of the resources and knowledge and skills that exist within your team, within the community that you work in, within the school communities that you work with, within students' families, all those sorts of assets. And so there's a reflection question to sort of think broadly about those resources that are available to you as part of your network. But then, of course, there are always challenges that need to be addressed. So we have a reflection question about those as well, thinking sort of at a big picture scale. What are some challenges and barriers you might have to modifying and improving your curriculum, and thinking about how you could address those. And then finally, as part of your discussion with your team, you're going to be thinking about which characteristics do we want to prioritize, to target, to improve our curriculum. So let's say you took a look at all of the instructional resources in your entire curriculum, and you notice that a particular characteristic is always being marked as absent in every activity that you do at outdoor school. That might be assigned to you that, hey, this is something that we should target to try to incorporate into our program. Actually, a suggestion that Dan had made, which I really thought was important when we were doing reviews of this, was also to think about what are those key experiences that make up your outdoor school program and start there. So of course, you're not going to be able to improve every single instructional resource for every single characteristic. And so there's some prioritizing that needs to happen. And so we really recommend looking at those things that are sort of absent over and over and over again, and focusing first on those activities that are really essential sort of keystone experiences as part of your outdoor school program. And then once you pick those 1 or 2 characteristics, what are some considerations related to targeting that specific characteristic? So do you have any particular assets, resources, relationships that might help with that particular characteristic, as well as specific challenges that you might face? And then sort of as to expand on this number 3 and number 4, the next page, page 22, is a curriculum improvement plan. So we've expanded this a little bit from the previous version and added a second one in case you would like to target 2 characteristics instead of 1. And so basically you note which characteristic are we targeting, and then we added this again to put this focus more on assets as opposed to challenges or barriers. What are the assets related to this characteristic that might help you to make these improvements? And then there's a table at the bottom that can sort of help to structure what are we trying to do, what specific tasks need to happen in order for us to be able to do that, and who's going to do them, and then start and end dates. And so for all of these tools that make up this sort of curriculum reflection report and improvement plan, we're putting these out sort of as options of ways that you might do this. And as you'll see sort of in the directions throughout the document, we call these things suggested instructions, recognizing that the way that your program operates or your particular needs may not fit exactly with the way that we have set this up. And so we encourage you to sort of modify things and do it differently as it suits your program's purpose. And so once you've then sort of gone through this curriculum improvement planning process of saying, okay, these are the characteristics we're going to target, and here's the action that we're going to take to actually make that change happen, you're moving now into the third phase of this evaluation cycle that Steve was talking about before, where you're actually out in your program, out in the world, applying those changes, improving your curriculum, and instructing students. And so this is like where the fun part is, right? Well, it's all fun, I guess, but this is a really fun part to sort of go out and see, okay, we've made these changes. What does it actually look like when we do these with students? And it's of course an iterative cycle. So you go out, you've made an improvement to some instructional resources or to some aspect of your curriculum as a whole. You go out and you try that with students, and probably some parts of it will go great, and some parts of it will be clear that there's some additional tweaking or changes that need to happen. And that's all just part of this process that we're all in, of sort of constantly trying to improve in this iterative way. And as I mentioned, this is something that we're trying to do with these self-evaluation tools from our perspective on our team. And so the feedback that we get from people when they're out applying these tools in the real world in their programs is so valuable to us as we move our way through this cycle, and keep these tools updated and as useful as possible for people. So now that we've gone over the entire document, I want to spend just a little bit of time. Actually, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions before I go on to describing the changes that we've made. So let me mute myself for a second. And if anyone has any thoughts or questions, we'd be happy to take them now.
Okay, me again.
Yes, Dan, go. Awesome.
Okay, so I was thinking about this, and maybe this is coming up, or maybe this is another conversation, but from the standpoint of professional development and the context that a lot of outdoor school programs operate in, and what I'm thinking about in particular is the relative churn of staff. So like this cycle happens one way when you have consistent people who are the same people going through this cycle, right? It's different when you have this constant influx of people that are entering at all sorts of points of this, right? And so the reason that I bring it up is I'm curious, and it just so I love the addition of sort of like, what are the assets that we have in order to be able to accomplish this great work and to do this change. I love the focus on intention and constant improvement. I love all of that. There's a part of it where like the framing of it as like, okay, we're going to fix the stuff that's broken, and that's like the focus. And so what I'm wondering is like, is there a way for us also to identify the area, like to do a thing that is like, let's look at everything that's in the highly effective realm, and let's make sure that we're continually putting that forward for in a space where you have a lot of people that are coming in and needing to sort of like, just in that context, right? So like, is there a way, or does anybody have any suggestions for how to make sure that you don't lose sight of what's going on that's highly effective, so that you can make sure that you continue to amplify that and continue to also feed that for folks, while also recognizing that, like, I mean, I'm a tinkerer, so I totally get the, like, I'm really drawn to the, like, what's not quite working and let's see how we can fix it. It's like, that's my nature. Anyway, I just wonder if there were any conversations on your team about that aspect of it, or if people have any thoughts about that. Hopefully that made sense.
That totally made sense. And I love that. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a great, like, now I'm like, we should make version 3.1 and put it out tomorrow. That's more clear in that curriculum report and improvement plan, to have a focus on that part of the process as well. And that, those reflection pages are sort of in large part focused on what can we improve, but maybe we should have one in there that's like, what are you doing well? And how are you going to, like what steps can you take with staff turnover or resources you could have that will sort of maintain that consistency in those areas where you're doing awesome work. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you bet. And I think there's an important analysis that happens there in understanding why you're doing that well, because that's going to inform how you can do other things better. So it's not just a happy accident that this is going well. There's actually like intention and work behind that that's creating that reality. And so understanding the intention and the work and the process that's creating that success helps you then apply that. That's where you grab that asset. Like what are the assets? Well, one of the assets is we're being really successful here. And why is that? Let's really uncover that and understand that, and then use that energy. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That was excellent feedback that I'm very much looking forward to incorporating. Other thoughts?
I just want to say that feedback applies to all the self-eval tools. And so now we've got, CSET, 1.1, CursET 1.1, or SET 3.1. So thanks.
Yeah, and I think, like, I can imagine, the line in the cultural responsiveness self-eval tool and the special education and accessibility one, that's like, celebrate what you're doing well. But there's such an imbalance between celebrate what you're doing well and then here's 3 or 4 pages to guide you through fixing things. Like, even the fact that we say celebrate is just not quite giving it that same close look that it deserves. So I totally agree. And Dan, I really appreciate you saying that. All right, so let's go into the updates that we have for this version, which hopefully there will now be a version 3.1 coming out soon that incorporates a little bit of what Dan suggested. But I'll go over the version 3.0 updates. So one of the things that we did was sort of clarify the distinction between the instructional resource section and the curriculum section, because there was a bit of confusion there when folks were using it. So we tried to call out at the beginning of the document, from pages 6 to 18, you're looking at individual instructional resources. And then starting on page 19, you're thinking about your curriculum as a whole. We also added a big tips section. And this is really sort of a lot of the feedback or anecdotes that we would hear about where people were getting stuck on using it. And so we added a whole section about that. So if you're familiar with the cultural responsiveness self-evaluation tool or the special education and accessibility self-evaluation tool, those both have tips pages. And so the ERSET now has its own tip page that provides similar guidance, but sort of tailored to this specific purpose. We also added more examples within the qualifier text in the hope that it will help people sort of visualize what we mean by that particular qualifier. So for example, in the reflective characteristic, which I believe is the very last one, one of the bullet points says the instructor rather than the student reflects on the presumed learning. And so as an example, the post-activity reflection might be limited to the instructor saying, so today we learned how pine cones open after fire. And that's not the sort of deep student-centered, student-driven reflection that we're necessarily going for. And so our hope is that some of those examples can help to make those descriptions just a little bit more clear to people. And then we edited and added some characteristics. So I'm going to sort of pretty quickly run through those changes. So first is theme number 1, context and settings for learning. What appeared in version 2.0 is over on the left in gray, and the current version is over on the right. As we had discussed earlier about the ordering of the characteristics, these lists are ordered based on what appears in version 3 but the ordering was different in the previous version. So the first characteristic we changed to promotes stimulating and responsive learning environment. And one reason we did this was because it provided a more clear place to incorporate social emotional learning into this tool as something that can be appearing in basically any instructional resource. Before, social emotional learning was sort of in an overall theme description, but it wasn't quite coming up in the table as we hoped that it would. The next one, we changed basically from reflects local community issues and needs to centers community experiences and perspectives. And I would say the key change here is this shift from reflect to center. So it can be pretty easy to look at a resource and say, oh yeah, this reflects this. It's a much higher bar to think about whose voice is being centered here. And so that's why we made that particular shift. And, you know, this entire thing is sort of aspirational. There's no way that everyone's going to be able, that really anyone could be highly effective in every single characteristic for any instructional resource. And so to the extent that we could, we sort of tried to shift them to what's the aspirational way to do this. And so moving from reflects to centers was one way that we did that. For the next one, there was sort of a mismatch between the content and the name of the characteristic. So in the previous version, culturally relevant to history of land, place, and space. But then the qualifiers were sort of about Indigenous experiences and relationships to land. So we decided to just call that out explicitly, so it's really clear what that characteristic is about. And we also added some information about how the materials were created. So were they sort of taken from the website of a local tribe? Were they developed in relationship with tribal communities, that sort of stuff? For the fourth one down, we added seasonally appropriate, recognizing that there's, of course, we have seasons here. So an activity that really takes advantage of your site in the fall is maybe not going to be able to take as great of advantage of your site in the spring. And so, or the other way around, or whatever the case may be. And so we wanted to call that out to encourage folks to sort of think about how they're using the natural assets of their site throughout the entire outdoor school season. And then we added a new characteristic in this theme called context appropriate materials and equipment, which just focuses on what are the materials that we're asking students to use. Are they developmentally appropriate? Are they something that most students are likely to be able to use? That sort of stuff. Any questions on this theme? Okay, I'll head on to the next one, which is content and integration. These mostly stayed the same. So the meets legislative guidelines one didn't change much at all. One thing to point out for the second one, so previously it said integrated with school curriculum and standards, and we changed it to classroom curriculum because, as many of you know, we're trying to emphasize this idea that outdoor school is part of school. And so we don't want a separation of the school curriculum from outdoor school, but rather it's all school, and the distinction we're making is what happens in the classroom before and after versus what's happening at outdoor school. And then on this last one, the word integration was sort of a point where folks were getting hung up in the name of that characteristic, so we just simplified it. Any questions about content and integration?
Just one quick little comment is that I'll be working, as you know, on some sort of professional development looking at that issue of classroom alignment with outdoor school. And it feels like something that really ultimately has to come from sort of both ends of that relationship that outdoor school can ask itself, how can we be more integrated into the classroom? And classroom teachers can also be asking, how can we more integrate what we do to support and align with outdoor school? So I hope to see that conversation be robust, from educators in both environments.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. And as Benno was sort of mentioning, we're in the process of planning a professional development for classroom teachers, specifically about sort of supporting integration of outdoor school with classroom, both academic learning and sort of supporting social emotional needs of students as part of the transition from classroom to outdoor school and back to classroom. And so, we might have, knowing that we have some districts or schools that run their own programs, for some people using the ERSET, it's going to be a little bit easier. For example, if the teacher is the one who does the outdoor school program themselves, obviously it's going to be easier for that person to integrate because they have full knowledge and control over that whole range. But yeah, it will definitely be something for us to keep pushing forward as far as what falls within whose control, and how can we sort of make that integration happen. So thanks for bringing that up, and y'all can look out for that PD in the fall.
Christy, can I just add another teachable moment here? We speak about aligning evaluation and professional development or outreach, and here's exactly that, right? Is we have a evaluative concept that we're thinking about, and then specifically crafting a professional development, which promotes more highly effective examples of this.
Thanks, Steve. All right, and I'll head on to our last one here, which is instruction and pedagogy. So most of these have remained the same. There were 5 in the original one, and we kept all 5 of those. There are some sort of minor changes to the descriptions within the table itself for those 5, but we added 2 new ones. And so the biggest addition, I would say, is this first one of sound instructional design. And so this is a huge topic, and we tried to sort of distill it down to some of the key ideas. But the basic idea of this characteristic is that there's tons of research out there about how people learn. So if you introduce vocabulary before students have any conceptual idea of what that word means, they're not likely to retain that. And so we should use all of that research in thinking about how we design our instructional resources. So we tried to pick a few of the main points from research about how people learn and incorporate it into that sound instructional design characteristic. We also added differentiation, or differentiated actually. And so we have the special education and accessibility self-evaluation tool, which covers this sort of in more depth and looking comprehensively sort of at supports for students with exceptional needs. But we thought it was important to include here as well. In particular, thinking like if we're using instructional resources that can't be adjusted or adapted to accommodate the different needs of our students, we sort of like backed ourselves into a corner a little bit and won't be able to sort of flexibly meet the needs of the students that we serve. So we thought it was important to call it out in this tool as well. And so those are sort of the main changes that we've made to the document. So if you were familiar with version 2, that was sort of the quick tour of what's going to be different in version 3. We have also added some new resources. So if you are familiar with the other self-evaluation tools, you will probably be familiar with the structure of this resource page, but I'm going to go ahead and show it to you right now. Let me get in here. All right, are you able to see the outdoor school website? Okay, cool. So I'm going to show you, I know it's a little hard sometimes to find things on our website, though you'll be pleased to know we are in the process of updating it, and it will have drop-down menus at the top to make it so much easier. But until then, if you come to our homepage in this What's New at Outdoor School banner right here, there's a button that says self-evaluation tools. And so if you click on that, it takes you to the page that has all three of the self-evaluation tools. So the instructional resource self-evaluation tool, the cultural responsiveness self-eval tool, and the special education and accessibility self-eval tool. And so first, I will say we're very delighted to finally have sort of updated, for now, versions of all three of these tools. So this has been a lot of work in the making. Steve and I will probably have a little celebration after this. Of course, more work to be done, but it's fun to hit some milestones. And so these are all sort of geared at, what support can we provide to programs to build capacity? So rather than us putting out checklists or here's exactly how you should do this, recognizing that everyone's situation is different, and we're trying to provide tools that we hope will support people in engaging in this work to the best of their ability and with our support. And for all of these, if you're trying to use it and you have an issue or a question, we absolutely would love for you to contact us, either to provide support or just a quick answer to your question, whatever you need. So I'm going to take us today into the instructional resource self-evaluation tool page, which has the link to the tool itself. This is where the link to the recording of today's webinar will be after it's edited to remove my side comments and has captions added. And then this is the resource page. Before we go to the resource page, I will point out that there is a glossary. So as you're looking at the tool, you may notice some places where there's an asterisk indicating that that word is in our glossary. So I'll click here. So these are words from the set as well as from the other two self-evaluation tools all combined into one list. So you can click and it gives you a definition of that term. And so that may be useful to you as you're using the tool. But I'm going to go to the resources page. So what we have here are, for every single characteristic in the tool, we have pulled together a list of a few resources. So the number that's in there varies, but these are basically little drop downs. And so if you're going to focus on ecologically and seasonally appropriate, for example, or as you're using the tool, you're like, I would like to know more about this topic, you can come here and we have the links as well as a tiny little annotation that describes what that particular resource is about, which will hopefully keep you from having to click on all the links to find what you're looking for. And so you can go through all of the characteristics in every theme and find sort of the same structured list of things. So something that we want to do, and maybe I'll go back to the PowerPoint here. No, let's see here. I'm trying a new screen share system today. So one thing that we want to include on these resources are case studies and examples. And this is for the instructional resource self-eval tool and for the other ones. Because we all know, like, someone can sort of describe something to you many times, but then once you hear, like, this is how someone actually did it, or this is what their lesson plan looks like, or you hear the story of, we were struggling with this, and these are the 2 actions we took in the short term and the 5 actions we took in the long term, or whatever, like those specific stories and case studies and examples are really what is often the most useful to people. And so we're hoping to be able to provide, and this will, I'm sure, be a multi-year project to cover all the topics that are in all of the self-evaluation tools, but we're hoping to share case studies and examples of outdoor schools doing this kind of work. So we can sometimes find case studies from other environments, but we would really love, to the extent possible, to have them be outdoor school specific to celebrate the amazing work that is being done in the Outdoor School Network. And also because then those examples will be super relevant to outdoor school because they're from outdoor school. So if you are sort of authentically engaging with culturally responsive evaluation, for example, using the self-eval tools? Are you implementing your curriculum, or are you in the process of updating it? So we're not just looking for, we have reached the summit on this, like we have this perfect activity for this particular thing. We're all constantly growing and improving. And so even those stories of like, what was your process like for, you know, it could be what Dan said. I'll keep that idea in the front of my mind. Like, what was your process for identifying the things where you were doing really well and putting supports in place or sort of safeguards to make sure that you keep operating at that high level for those characteristics? It could be about places where you're improving, or are you engaged in meaningful professional development? And there's a story that you would like to share there about how that professional development has affected your program. So we would love any case studies and examples for this. I do want to say, like, I recognize that we are the funding agency, OSU, and so I want to be super clear that we're not expecting or requiring people to share these things. And should you choose to, they would never be used in a punitive way. It's totally voluntary and up to you. We're trying to think about what platform do we have sort of as the statewide organization for sharing these sorts of resources across the outdoor school network. But please know that it's totally voluntary. And so if you think, oh, I already have a specific example of something that I would like to share, we will gladly take those. Or if you're like, I'm not exactly sure, but we're totally open to someone contacting us to talk about this, we would gladly take that as well. Steve, anything to add to that?
Nope, this is just really exciting work, and I'm so excited to be with everyone doing it.
Great.
Yeah.
And also, like, a side benefit of this sort of case study example thing, at least for me, as you all know, I'm actually not that new to outdoor school. I guess I've been here for a year, but I haven't really had an opportunity to immerse myself into the outdoor school yet. And so these stories of the work that's being done and the way that kids are being impacted is just so fulfilling for me. And I think for everyone on our team to hear about the amazing work that people are doing. So feel free to contact us if you are interested and willing to participate in something like that. So my email address is over here on the bottom, and so is Steve's. You could always get us at outdoorschool@oregonstate.edu as well. So I think that's about all we have for you today. And so I'd like to pause for a moment and see if there are any questions or comments before we send folks off to enjoy the rest of their day.
Thanks for the thoughtful presentation and all the work.
Thanks for joining. And Dan has me jazzed. I was saying, like, we're so excited to celebrate. We've crossed over this little hump, which is still celebratable. And also I'm now already like, ooh, I'm so excited to make more changes. So thanks again, Dan, for that
That's
great
the best
feedback.
kind of celebration. I'm
Yes.
stoked about what we just did, and I can't wait to get back at it again.
Totally. Yeah, thank you.
I really like the word celebratable. I think that's, I don't know if it's an official word, but I think, it's a good one.
Agreed.
Can we add it to the glossary?
Yes. We should.
I have a
Nice.
question for the folks on the call. So when thinking about applying the self-eval tools over time, Dan, you mentioned something about folks moving on, right? This is systemic, this is organizational. I just invite folks to think about ways in which to make sure that the information around eval remains in perpetuity, right? If that looks like organizations get some sort of structure on how to create their own database, right? Or just spreadsheet, really. If that goes to an external evaluator to then have that information, like what does that look like in just a respectful way that can support a broad longitudinal view of organizational change? And so I don't know if there's an answer to that, but I just want to invite you to think about it.
Something that we are working on, which is a lofty project, but it's to really formalize our curriculum. So all new people can come in and we can just hand them the curriculum that they want. Our model has always been that you come in and you can use some stuff that's it here, you can make your own stuff, and that's not always best practice, especially with curriculum and creating the best curriculum that we can. So we're working on kind of that standardized set. We've shared those with Christy, and like talking about 1.0, 2.0, like I'm ready to like dig into this tool and really look at what we created and see what else we can do to improve it. But that would help. I think that's our idea, is that would help with, you know, every new staff member that comes in, just say, we're going to use this base set of curriculum. And if you want to expand on that, we can do that later. But like right now, this is the stuff that we're using. It will help them a lot with their preparation and getting ready and not freaking out about writing new curriculum every session, not reinventing the wheel every single session. So that's one thing that we're working on. And there was something else I was thinking of about that, and I can't remember what it is, but that's an approach that we're taking to kind of help curb that a little bit.
And this goes from that, not back to Steve's question, but possibly in a slightly different direction. So Dan and I have just started talking about what would it look like. Well, so in the ERSET, the instruction and pedagogy section is only things that would conceivably appear in a written resource. And so we know there's all these other things related to instruction and pedagogy, you know, the way that an instructor fosters discussion, or the way they use people's names, or whatever it might be, all these other pieces of instruction and pedagogy that aren't captured in this particular resource because they wouldn't most likely be written down in a lesson plan or something like that. And so we're starting to think about, what does it look like to provide support for that other aspect of instruction and pedagogy? And so if there's anyone on here who would be interested in talking with us about that, maybe you already have tools that you use, like observation tools or protocols or discussion reflection prompts that you use with your staff to talk about those sorts of things, we would be very interested in hearing about those. And Dan, if you want to add anything to that, please feel free.
I'll just say that, like, what prompted that, it was a lot of the work that Andrea and Jennifer and I did related to that exact thing, like thinking about those tools. So I just want to give credit to like the seed for that is the stuff that's been developed, and I would be really excited to I think that like when we think about like these, like the resource is foundational, but the students interact with the person who's doing the teaching. They don't interact with the resource. You know, they interact with people. So I'm excited to, I'm not discounting all of this. It's super important. And there's this part of it that I think that we can look at that can be really inspiring and also really help us continue to improve the delivery of outdoor school. So thanks, Christy, for
Yeah, totally. And just thinking about, like, obviously time is limited. And so if time can be shifted from reinventing the same activity over and over again every session by a different person, and instead that time can be focused on supporting, you know, teaching methods and that sort of stuff, that shift might really pay off, knowing that we are limited in how much training time and support we can provide to people. So thanks. I think, yeah, they could work hand in hand for sure.
And I've been reflecting on the sound instructional design section that has been added, and I love that section because I think that it really does give a kind of a broad way to think about how people are building their curriculum and building their design of the lessons. I'm wondering if there's a way to include like a sound instructional practice section to kind of tie in what Dan was saying earlier, that might be one way. And the other thing I've been thinking about is I love the glossaries, because I haven't really thought about sound instructional design in the way that it is framed in here, but I think that it totally ties with what teachers think about in their everyday world. And it may be new to some program providers or environmental educators. And so I love that it's kind of laid out there. Is there a way to link the glossary or reflection, or not reflection, like resources directly to the tool, as a way of, if somebody is like, I'm curious about learning more about instructional design or sound instructional design, where do I go to find those? That is really seamless.
Yes, thank you for that. I haven't thought about it with the resources, but we are thinking about and trying to figure out the best way to sort of get the definitions to be more of like, if you're using the online version, we will ultimately end up with at least some of these printed out, but like a hover over situation where you can hover over the word and make the definition pop up. I hadn't thought about adding the resources, but I think that's a great idea. Like it could just be a little link sort of maybe in the bottom of the evidence box for each one that says like resources, and it links directly to the ones for that particular characteristic. Yeah, thank you for that. Does that capture what you meant? Okay, great.
So again, credit where credit's due. So I put a link in there of a document that Jennifer worked on a few years ago that aligns MESE curriculum to NGSS. It has that same kind of feature. So you can hover over nutrient cycle decomposition and it'll define what that is from NGSS. So it just, not that you need necessarily a model, but if you want to see something that might work, I put it in the chat.
Yes, thank you. I absolutely do want to see something that might work. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're sort of in the process of updating our website. And so part of that conversation has been about what exists on the website as PDFs, which are sort of apparently quite difficult for screen readers sometimes to navigate, versus what appears on the website itself or what appears in both. And so I will absolutely look at that as we figure out how to make it as useful as possible. We've also been thinking about like, could there be, this would be a long-term project, so no one get too excited about it, of like, could there be some way that folks could sort of enter their comments and qualifications sort of directly into something that then as a team would sort of all come together in a centralized location? So that's a thought that we've had, but not something that we're sort of on the precipice of getting to right now. But just thinking about how to make them as easy to actually use as possible. Recognizing that lots of folks, if you're doing 20 lessons and you have 4 people looking at each one, like, are you really going to print 80 of these things out? So we've been thinking about that as well. So if anyone has ideas on that, feel free to pass them along.
I just also want to add in that idea is that when folks were doing their big group team discussion, if they could also access their program specific reports for the outcomes year after year after year, you could almost imagine a secure landing page for each program, which allowed them to access all of those things, perhaps all the PD that their program has participated in, really just have like a solid place to be able to do some program specific inquiry on all their program specific evaluation and learning activities. Pretty cool.
Christy, I love the notion of, providing people with tools that are functionally relevant and helpful. You know, when you have to do, we have to do this big data grab and then actually help people figure out a way to sift through it all and sort through things and evaluate things. It's really helpful to have introduction to particular programs and functions that would help them do that. That said, I also think that when we're dealing with education programs, maybe even outdoor school in particular, the level of format of how much stuff is already written down or isn't written down, where the knowledge exists, whether it's in somebody's head or in a box somewhere on some like laminated cue cards, like it's really all over the map. And so I can't imagine that there wouldn't be just like a whole lot of that even before you even get to the point of like, how are we going to evaluate what's written? There's just like, is it even written? And so, yeah, it's a big logistical thing, but I do appreciate the idea of thinking about how to support that, because sometimes people get overwhelmed with that lift of just, we want to do this work, but we're not even quite sure.
So long, Benno. He just got kicked off. And that's a good point that I didn't mention earlier, which is that another one of the tips that we added is about, if your curriculum is written down, which is sort of the main intended use of the document, here's how you do it. But if your curriculum, if you don't have written instructional resources, here's a way that you could sort of try to use the ERSET, because one of the things we're trying to do sort of in our messaging overall is empower people to recognize that no matter where you are on that continuum, there are ways to move forward. And so not having your curriculum written down, like that's not a reason to not be thinking about and reflecting on what you're doing. Even if the lift is too heavy to right now write everything down, we still want to be having these conversations and trying to move it forward and recognize what we're doing well. Oh, thanks, Jennifer.
Sorry, my I click enter and then I anyway, yeah, that's we cut and pasted the words from the curse set into a Google document when we're having our meeting, that so that we could add in our evidence, add in our reflection, and take notes all in one document.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
I will definitely be
the
taking a look at that.
Google platform's great if you can use it for,
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be super complex because you can put links in there to other documents. Like you could link you can put hot links and everything, but some people might find, like if they're already using a collaboration platform like Asana or something, like there may be a functionality in there. I'm not as familiar with those, but I like the idea of being able to not have to hunt too hard. Like it's going to be hard enough to hunt for the stuff that the outdoor school program has produced and created and stuff. So if you don't have to hunt for the other stuff, then when you've got people working asynchronously and across seasons and stuff, it could be really helpful. That's great, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we had maybe a Google version and an Excel version, people could sort of do with that what they want, whichever one fits whatever platform they're using. That might get us where we need to be, at least for now, until we can hopefully some years down the road have a more sophisticated situation that matches what Steve was describing, where people are able to sort of access all of the information related to their program in one place. Great. Well, I see it's 11:57. So I will gladly stay on here for any folks who would like to continue chatting. But also I'd like to respect your time and wish you a good day. And thanks so much for joining us here today. If you have additional comments on the tool as you start to dig into it, please let us know, because I have a feeling there will be a version 3.1 update coming out at some point here in the future. And so if there are other comments and things that we can address in addition to practicing what we preach and focusing on assets, we would be happy to make those changes. So just let us know. And Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I know there's a feedback form on the website. I think in the instructional resources, does it specifically call to self-eval tools, or is that just broadly around professional development?
It does not specifically go to the self-eval tools, but we could consider adding something like that.
Cool. So then we could have an anonymous feedback form that folks could go to, whether they're in Oregon or nationally or wherever, recognizing that a lot of different people are using these.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great idea.
Let's do it.
Awesome. Well, enjoy the rest of your Thursday, everyone. And then it's Friday, woohoo, and then the weekend. So enjoy.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
It was great to see everyone.
Mhm.
Thanks so much, everybody, for all your hard work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mhm.